The photograph should have stayed in the attic. For 122 years, it remained hidden beneath moth-eaten quilts and forgotten letters, waiting in the darkness of a Massachusetts estate sale. But on a cold October morning in 2025, Margaret Sullivan pulled it from a cardboard box marked "Missed Items," and everything changed. The image showed what appeared to be an ordinary family from 1903. A stern-looking father stood at the center, his hand resting on a carved wooden chair. His wife sat beside him, her face pale and expressionless, while 3 children stood in descending order of height. The photographer had captured them in the parlor of their home, the wallpaper faded even then, the furniture heavy and dark. Everyone wore their Sunday best. Everyone looked directly at the camera. It seemed peaceful, almost boring, until Margaret noticed something in the ornate mirror hanging behind the father's left shoulder. Margaret was a 43-year-old antique dealer from Salem, Massachusetts. She had been buying and selling historical items for nearly 2 decades, working out of a cramped shop on Essex Street that smelled perpetually of old paper and lemon oil. Her specialty was Victorian and Edwardian-era photographs, the kind that families no longer wanted but couldn't quite throw away. She understood that each image held a story, a frozen moment that someone once considered important enough to preserve. That morning, she had arrived at the Whitmore estate sale early, before the crowds descended. The house was a crumbling Queen Anne Victorian on the outskirts of Boston, scheduled for demolition within the month. Inside, the accumulated possessions of 5 generations lay scattered across dusty floors. The mirror's reflection showed something the posed family members couldn't see. In its silvered surface, partially obscured by the father's broad shoulders, was the image of the mother's face. But it wasn't the same face that appeared in the main photograph. The reflected face was turned slightly, and even across more than a century of aging photographic paper, Margaret could see the expression clearly. The woman's mouth was open, caught mid-word or mid-cry. Her eyes, which faced the camera so calmly in the primary image, showed something else entirely in the reflection. They showed fear, raw, unmistakable fear, and there was something else. A dark shadow along her left cheekbone that looked like a bruise, visible only in the mirror's reflection, hidden from the camera's direct view by careful positioning and perhaps powder or makeup. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the photograph closer to the window light. The image was a cabinet card, 6.5 inches by 4.25, mounted on thick cardboard backing. The photographer's mark was still legible on the bottom right corner, embossed in fading gold letters. Harrison & Sons Photography, Boston, Massachusetts, established 1878. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, in careful handwriting now browned with age, someone had written names and a date. The Whitmore family, December 1803, Beacon Hill residence. Below that, in different ink and a shakier hand, were additional words that made Margaret's breath catch. May God forgive us for our silence. She purchased the photograph for $12, along with several other items to avoid drawing attention to her real interest. The estate sale volunteer, a tired-looking woman in her 60s, barely glanced at her selections before tallying the total. Margaret carried her acquisitions to her car, but instead of driving back to her shop, she sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes studying the photograph. The father, according to the names on the back, was Thomas Whitmore. The mother was Eleanor. The children were Catherine, age 12, William, age 9, and little Margaret, age 5. Someone had given that child her own name more than a century before her birth. Back at her shop, Margaret locked the door and turned the sign to closed. She needed time to think, to research, to understand what she was looking at. She set up her photography equipment, a digital camera with a macro lens that she used for catalog images. Under bright lights, she photographed every detail of the cabinet card, paying special attention to the mirror's reflection. When she uploaded the images to her computer and enlarged them, the details became even clearer. The bruise on Eleanor Whitmore's reflected face was unmistakable. So was the expression of terror in her eyes. But there was more. In the extreme corner of the mirror, barely visible, was the edge of something else, a hand, perhaps, or an arm, positioned just out of the camera's main frame. It appeared to be gripping something, a dark object that Margaret couldn't quite identify. She spent the rest of that day searching historical records. The Whitmore name appeared frequently in Boston archives. Thomas Whitmore had been a successful merchant, importing textiles from Europe and selling them to the growing department stores of the northeastern United States. He had served on several civic committees and donated money to build a library in his neighborhood. Newspaper articles from the early 1900s praised his business acumen and his devotion to his family. One article from 1904 described a lavish party he had hosted for his daughter Catherine's 13th birthday. Eleanor Whitmore was mentioned only in passing in these accounts, always as Thomas's wife, never as a person with her own identity or accomplishments. This was typical for the era, but it made Margaret uneasy. Margaret knew she needed expert help. The following morning, she contacted Dr. Rebecca Chen, a professor of American social history at Boston University. They had worked together before, when Margaret had discovered a collection of letters written by a female factory worker during the 1880s. Dr. Chen had used those letters in a published paper about women's labor conditions, and she had credited Margaret with the find. Now, Margaret hoped Dr. Chen could provide context for the Whitmore photograph. She sent an email with the digital images attached and received a response within 3 hours. Dr. Chen wanted to meet immediately. They sat together in Dr. Chen's office the next afternoon, surrounded by books and academic journals stacked on every available surface. Dr. Chen was in her 50s, with short grey hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She examined the photographs on her computer screen for a long time before speaking. When she finally looked up at Margaret, her expression was grave. "This photograph was evidence," she said. "Evidence of domestic violence in an era when such violence was rarely acknowledged, never mind documented. The careful positioning of the family, the powder on Eleanor's face to hide the bruise from the camera's direct view, the terror caught accidentally in the mirror's reflection. All of it pointed to a household where abuse was occurring and where everyone, including the photographer, participated in hiding it." Dr. Chen explained what life was like for women in 1903. Massachusetts had criminalized spousal assault in 1871, one of the first states to do so, but enforcement was rare and inconsistent. The prevailing attitude held that what happened between a husband and wife was a private matter, not subject to public scrutiny or legal intervention. Women who spoke out about abuse faced social ostracism, economic ruin, and the loss of their children. Divorce was possible, but scandalous and difficult to obtain. Most women had no means of supporting themselves financially. They were entirely dependent on their husbands for food, shelter, and social standing. If a woman left an abusive marriage, she left with nothing, and society blamed her for the family's dissolution. The photograph suggested that Eleanor Whitmore was trapped in exactly this situation. The bruise, the fear in her eyes, the note written on the back years later, all of it indicated sustained abuse. But Dr. Chen pointed out something else that Margaret hadn't considered. The children in the photograph showed no obvious signs of distress. Their faces were calm, even blank. This suggested they had learned to hide their feelings, to present a false front to the outside world. Growing up in a household where violence was normal, where they watched their father hurt their mother and were powerless to stop it, would have caused profound psychological damage. Research showed that children who witnessed domestic violence were more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems. They were also more likely to either become abusers themselves or to enter abusive relationships as adults. Margaret asked about the note on the back of the photograph. "May God forgive us for our silence." Who had written those words, and when? Dr. Chen examined the handwriting in the digital image. The ink was different from the original notation, suggesting it had been added years, perhaps decades later. The handwriting appeared shakier, possibly indicating it was written by someone elderly or someone whose hands trembled with emotion. It could have been written by one of the children after they reached adulthood, finally acknowledging what they had witnessed but failed to stop. Or it could have been written by someone else who knew the family, a relative or friend who carried guilt for not intervening. Without more information, it was impossible to know for certain. Dr. Chen suggested they search for additional records about the Whitmore family: death certificates, census records, newspaper articles, court documents, anything that might reveal what happened to Eleanor and her children. Margaret agreed. What had started as a simple antique purchase had become something much larger. She felt a responsibility to Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had been dead for more than a century, but whose suffering was still visible in this photograph. If no one had helped her then, perhaps uncovering her story now could serve as a form of justice, however delayed. They divided the research tasks. Dr. Chen would search academic databases and historical archives at the university. Margaret would visit the Massachusetts State Archives and the Boston Public Library to examine physical records. They would meet again in 3 days to share what they had found. As Margaret left the university campus, she felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. She was about to dive deep into a family's darkest secrets, secrets that had been carefully hidden for generations. But she couldn't stop now. The image of Eleanor's terrified face in the mirror stayed with her, haunting her thoughts and demanding answers. The Massachusetts State Archives occupied a modern building in Boston, a stark contrast to the historical documents it contained. Margaret arrived when the doors opened at 9 in the morning, armed with the information she had gathered so far. She requested death certificates for Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore, census records from 1900 through 1920, and any court documents associated with the Whitmore name. The archivist, a young man with glasses and a name tag that read David, told her it would take several hours to pull everything. She settled into a research room with her laptop and waited. The death certificates arrived first. Thomas Whitmore had died on March 15, 1921, at the age of 62. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. He had lived 18 years beyond the photograph, dying peacefully in his sleep, according to the attending physician's notes. Margaret felt a surge of anger. The man who had apparently terrorized his family for years had died comfortable and respected, probably surrounded by people who praised his accomplishments. Eleanor's death certificate told a different story. She had died on August 3, 1911, at the age of 43. The cause of death was listed as complications from a fall. She had been only 8 years older than the 1903 photograph, meaning she had endured at least 8 more years of whatever hell that household contained. Margaret read the death certificate 3 times, her suspicion growing with each reading. Complications from a fall. It was a common euphemism in that era for deaths that were suspicious, but not investigated. Women who were beaten to death by their husbands often had their deaths attributed to falls, accidents, or sudden illnesses. Without a thorough investigation, which rarely occurred in cases of domestic violence, the truth remained hidden. The death certificate provided an address. The Whitmore family had lived at 167 Beacon Hill, the same address listed on the photograph. Margaret wrote it down, planning to visit the location later. The census records revealed more details about the family's structure over time. In the 1900 census, Thomas Whitmore was listed as head of household, age 41, occupation merchant. Eleanor was listed as wife, age 32, with no occupation noted. This was standard for married women of the time. The 3 children were listed with their ages matching what was written on the photograph. By the 1910 census, taken just months before Eleanor's death, the household had changed. Thomas was still listed as head, now age 51. Catherine, age 19, was listed as living at home with no occupation. William, age 16, was listed as a student. Little Margaret, age 12, was also listed as a student. Eleanor was still alive at the time of this census, age 42, still listed with no occupation. But there was an additional person in the household that year, a woman named Judith Palmer, age 37, listed as housekeeper. The presence of a housekeeper suggested the family had maintained their wealth, but it also suggested something else. In households where domestic violence occurred, other adults were often present but remained silent. They either didn't witness the abuse, or they chose not to see it, or they saw it and said nothing because speaking out would cost them their employment. Margaret wondered if Judith Palmer had been there the night Eleanor died from her supposed fall. Had she witnessed what really happened? Had she helped cover it up? Or had she been as trapped and powerless as Eleanor herself? The 1920 census, taken the year before Thomas died, showed a significantly different household. Thomas, age 61, was listed as widowed and retired. Catherine, age 29, was no longer listed at the Beacon Hill address. William, age 26, was listed as living at home occupation clerk. Young Margaret, age 22, was also living at home with no occupation listed. Judith Palmer was no longer with the family. Margaret made notes about the children's whereabouts. Catherine had left the family home, but where had she gone? Had she married? Had she simply run away from her father and the memories of what she had witnessed? The court documents David brought her were extensive. Thomas Whitmore had been involved in numerous business disputes over the years, lawsuits regarding contracts and payments, nothing unusual for a merchant of his status. But there was one record that stood out. In 1909, 2 years before Eleanor's death, a complaint had been filed with the Boston Police Department regarding a disturbance at 167 Beacon Hill. The complaint was brief, noting that neighbors had reported sounds of shouting and breaking glass coming from the residence late at night. An officer had been dispatched to investigate. The report stated that Mr. Whitmore had answered the door and assured the officer that everything was fine, that there had been a minor accident with some dishware, but nothing of concern. The officer had not entered the home. No further action was taken. Margaret stared at the police report for a long time. This was it. This was documentation that something was wrong in that household, that the violence had been loud enough for neighbors to hear, that someone had cared enough to call the police, but it had gone nowhere. The officer had taken Thomas Whitmore's word and left. He hadn't asked to see Eleanor or the children. He hadn't investigated further. This was typical of police response to domestic violence calls in that era. Husbands were believed, wives were invisible, and the abuse continued behind closed doors, sanctioned by a system that refused to intervene in family matters. Margaret left the archives late that afternoon with copies of everything she had found. She drove directly to Beacon Hill, one of Boston's oldest and most prestigious neighborhoods. The streets were narrow and steep, lined with brick townhouses that had stood for more than 2 centuries. She found 167 without difficulty. The building was still standing, now painted a tasteful shade of cream with black shutters and a glossy black door. A brass plaque beside the entrance indicated it had been converted into luxury condominiums sometime in the 1980s. Margaret parked across the street and sat in her car, looking up at the windows, trying to imagine what had happened inside those walls. She wondered which room had been the parlor where the photograph was taken. She wondered where Eleanor had fallen, or been pushed, or been beaten until her injuries killed her. She wondered if the current residents knew about the history of their building, or if they went about their daily lives completely unaware that a woman had died there under suspicious circumstances more than a century ago. The contrast between the building's current expensive elegance and its dark past seemed obscene to her. Someone was paying probably several $1 million to live in a place where murder might have occurred. Margaret's phone rang. It was Dr. Chen calling with an update. She had found something significant in the university's newspaper archives. In December of 1911, 4 months after Eleanor's death, the Boston Evening Transcript had published a small article about Catherine Whitmore. She had been arrested for causing a public disturbance outside her father's place of business. According to the article, Catherine had been shouting at customers, accusing her father of murder, claiming he had killed her mother, and that no one would listen to her. The police had removed her from the scene. The charges were later dropped, but not before the newspaper published her accusations. Dr. Chen was sending Margaret the article images immediately. Margaret pulled up her email on her phone and opened the attachments. The newspaper clipping was brief, only 3 paragraphs, and it was written with clear bias against Catherine. The language described her as hysterical, irrational and overwrought with grief. It suggested her accusations were the result of an unbalanced mind, unable to cope with her mother's accidental death. There was no investigation into her claims. No one interviewed her privately to hear her full story. Instead, she was dismissed as a mad woman, and her father was portrayed as the victim of her unfounded attacks. The final sentence of the article noted that Miss Whitmore had been placed in the care of relatives in New York State, where she would receive proper medical attention for her nervous condition. Dr. Chen's voice on the phone was tight with anger. This was how women were silenced in that era, she said. If they spoke out about abuse, they were labeled insane and institutionalized. Catherine Whitmore had tried to tell the truth about her father, and she had been punished for it. She had been removed from Boston, sent away from everyone who might have believed her, and quite possibly locked in an asylum where she could be controlled and forgotten. Dr. Chen had already begun searching for records of psychiatric institutions in New York State from that time period, trying to trace what had happened to Catherine after she was sent away. Margaret asked about the other children. What had happened to William and young Margaret? Why hadn't they supported their sister's accusations? Dr. Chen speculated that they might have been too frightened to speak. Their father still controlled their lives, their finances, their futures. If they spoke against him, they risked being disinherited or sent away like Catherine, or perhaps they had internalized the abuse so deeply that they couldn't acknowledge it, even to themselves. This was common among children who grew up in violent households. They learned to deny reality, to rewrite their memories, to convince themselves that what they witnessed wasn't as bad as it seemed. It was a survival mechanism, but it came at a terrible psychological cost. The two women agreed to continue their research. Dr. Chen would focus on finding Catherine's records and tracking what happened to her in New York. Margaret would try to locate information about William and young Margaret to see if they ever acknowledged the truth about their family. As they ended the call, Margaret looked once more at the building that had been the Whitmore home. The windows reflected the late afternoon sun, their surfaces blank and revealing nothing. But somewhere inside that building, more than a century ago, a woman had lived in fear, had died under suspicious circumstances, and had been forgotten by everyone except one daughter, who tried and failed to get justice for her. Margaret started her car and pulled away from Beacon Hill. She had a photograph, death certificates, census records, police reports, and a newspaper article. She had evidence of what the Whitmore family wanted hidden, what they had carefully concealed behind formal portraits and respectable appearances. But she didn't yet have the complete story. She needed to know what happened to all three children. She needed to understand the full scope of the damage that Thomas Whitmore had inflicted on his family. And she needed to find out who had written those words on the back of the photograph, decades after it was taken. May God forgive us for our silence. Someone in that family had finally acknowledged the truth, had finally admitted their failure to protect Eleanor. Margaret was determined to discover who. Dr. Chen called Margaret 3 days later with news about Catherine Whitmore. She had found records from the Hudson Valley Psychiatric Institute in New York, where Catherine had been committed in January of 1912, just weeks after her public outburst in Boston. The records were disturbing. Catherine had been diagnosed with hysteria and delusional disorder, common labels applied to women who spoke uncomfortable truths in that era. She had been subjected to treatments that were considered standard practice at the time, but would now be recognized as torture. Cold water baths, forced sedation, isolation in darkened rooms for days at a time. The medical notes described her as uncooperative and resistant to treatment, which meant she continued to insist that her father had murdered her mother. The Institute records showed that Catherine remained there for 7 years. During that time, she received only 2 visitors. The first was her brother William, who came once in 1913 and never returned. The second was a woman named Sarah Mitchell, identified in the visitor logs as a family friend, who came regularly every few months from 1914 until 1919. Dr. Chen had found no other information about Sarah Mitchell yet, but her consistent visits suggested she believed Catherine, or at least cared enough to maintain contact when everyone else had abandoned her. Catherine was finally released in 1919, at age 28. Not because she had been cured, but because the Institute needed her bed for the wave of shell-shocked soldiers returning from World War I. Margaret asked what happened to Catherine after her release. Dr. Chen had traced her through city directories and census records. She had moved to a boarding house in Albany, New York, and found work as a seamstress. She never married. She lived quietly, apparently keeping to herself, until her death in 1953 at age 62. The cause of death was pneumonia. She had died alone in her small apartment, and it took 3 days for anyone to notice. The obituary in the Albany newspaper was 4 sentences long. It mentioned no surviving family members. It seemed that after spending 7 years in an asylum for trying to tell the truth, Catherine had lived the rest of her life in isolation, cut off from everyone who had known her before. The cruelty of it overwhelmed Margaret. Catherine had watched her father abuse her mother for years. She had seen her mother die under suspicious circumstances. She had tried to speak out to demand justice, and she had been locked away and tortured for it. Then she had been released into a world that still didn't believe her, still considered her unstable, and she had spent nearly 35 more years living with the knowledge that no one would ever acknowledge what had happened. Margaret wondered if Catherine had been the one who wrote the note on the back of the photograph. May God forgive us for our silence. But the timeline didn't quite work. The handwriting appeared elderly and shaky, and Catherine had died in 1953. If she had written it, she would have been in her 60s, which was possible but not certain. Dr. Chen had also found information about William Whitmore. He had lived a very different life from his sister. After Catherine was sent to New York, William had remained in Boston, working as a clerk in his father's business. When Thomas died in 1921, William inherited the company. He married in 1923 a woman named Dorothy Fletcher from a respectable Boston family. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. William expanded the textile business and became quite successful. He served on the same civic committees his father had served on. He donated money to the same causes. To the outside world, he was exactly like his father, a pillar of the community, a family man, a success. But Dr. Chen had found something else. In 1947, Dorothy Whitmore had filed for divorce, which was still rare and scandalous at that time. The divorce records were sealed, as was common then, but the newspaper coverage provided hints. Dorothy had been granted the divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. She had been awarded custody of their 2 children, who were adults by then, but still mentioned in the proceedings. William had been ordered to pay substantial financial support. The Boston Globe article about the divorce had been carefully worded, but it suggested that William's treatment of his wife had been severe enough that even in an era when divorce was deeply frowned upon, the court had sided with her without hesitation. Margaret understood what this meant. William had become his father. He had witnessed years of domestic violence as a child, had watched his mother die from it, had seen his sister punished for speaking about it, and then he had done the exact same thing to his own wife. This pattern was well documented in research about domestic violence. Children who grew up in abusive households often repeated the behavior as adults. They learned that violence was normal, that it was an acceptable way to exert control, that there would be no real consequences. William had learned all of this from Thomas, and Dorothy had paid the price just as Eleanor had. Margaret asked about young Margaret, the child who shared her name. This search had been more difficult, Dr. Chen explained. Young Margaret had disappeared from records after the 1920 census. She wasn't listed in the 1930 census, not at her father's address or anywhere else Dr. Chen could find. There was no marriage record, no death record, nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished. This could mean several things. She might have married and moved to another state without leaving easily traceable records. She might have changed her name. Or, Dr. Chen suggested grimly, she might have died young and been buried in an unmarked grave or under another name. Women who left their families or who were estranged often ended up lost to history, their lives undocumented and forgotten. The mystery of young Margaret bothered both women. 2 of the 3 children were now accounted for. Catherine had tried to tell the truth and been destroyed for it. William had become his father and perpetuated the cycle of violence. But what about the youngest child? The 5-year-old in the photograph who had witnessed everything. Where had she gone? What had her life been like? And could she have been the one who wrote the note on the photograph decades later, finally acknowledging the family's terrible secret? Margaret decided to approach the problem from a different angle. She returned to the estate sale where she had found the photograph. The Whitmore house on Beacon Hill had been demolished, but the estate sale had been held at a different location, the Queen Anne Victorian on the outskirts of Boston. She needed to know whose estate it had been and how they had come to possess the Whitmore family photograph. She contacted the estate sale company, a business called Heritage Liquidations, that specialized in clearing out the homes of deceased people who had no direct heirs or whose heirs didn't want the possessions. The owner of Heritage Liquidations was a woman named Patricia Monroe, in her late 60s, who had been running estate sales for 40 years. Margaret met her at a coffee shop in Cambridge and explained what she was looking for. Patricia remembered the sale clearly. The house had belonged to a woman named Ruth Whitmore Davison, who had died at age 97 the previous June. Ruth had been a recluse, living alone in the house for the final 30 years of her life. She had no children, and her only surviving relative was a nephew in California who had hired Patricia to liquidate everything. The nephew had taken nothing from the house, wanting only the proceeds from the sale. Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Ruth Whitmore. Young Margaret's real name had been Margaret Ruth Whitmore, according to the handwriting on the back of the photograph. She had gone by her middle name, Ruth. This had to be her. Margaret asked Patricia if she remembered anything specific about the woman or the house. Patricia nodded slowly. The house had been extraordinary, she said, filled with decades of accumulated possessions, newspapers from the 1920s through the 2000s, books stacked in every room, photographs and documents stored in boxes that had clearly never been opened. Ruth Whitmore Davison had been a hoarder, though Patricia used the more gentle term collector. It had taken weeks to sort through everything. Patricia also remembered that Ruth had left very specific instructions in her will about the disposition of her possessions. Everything was to be sold without exception. The money was to go to 3 charities: the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, the Women's Shelter Network of Massachusetts, and an organization that provided legal assistance to domestic violence survivors. Patricia had thought it was an unusual combination of beneficiaries for a woman who had no apparent connection to those causes. But the will was clear, and the nephew had followed his aunt's instructions. Every penny from the estate sale had been divided among those 3 charities. Margaret sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by what this meant. Ruth, who had been little Margaret in the photograph, had spent her entire adult life alone. She had never married, never had children, never let anyone close enough to hurt her the way her father had hurt her mother. And when she died, she had made sure that her life's accumulated possessions would be sold to benefit other women, trying to escape the same violence she had witnessed as a child. It was an act of atonement, perhaps, or an act of solidarity with women she would never meet, but whose suffering she understood intimately. Margaret asked if Patricia had kept any records of what had been in the estate. Patricia said she always kept detailed inventory lists, both for insurance purposes and for potential disputes with heirs. She would send Margaret the full list from Ruth's estate. 2 days later, the email arrived with an attached spreadsheet containing hundreds of items. Margaret scrolled through it slowly, looking for anything significant. Most items were ordinary: furniture and household goods and clothing. But there were several boxes listed simply as personal papers and photographs. Margaret had purchased the Whitmore family photograph from one of those boxes. What else had been in there? She contacted Patricia again and asked if it would be possible to see the remaining unsold items from Ruth's estate. Patricia explained that everything had been sold, but she had taken photographs of unusual or potentially valuable items before the sale for her records. She would look through those photographs and send anything related to the Whitmore family. A week later, Margaret received another email with 15 image files attached. Most were pictures of old furniture and decorative items, but 3 of the images showed documents that made Margaret's hands shake. The first was a diary, clearly old, with a cracked leather cover. Patricia's photograph showed the diary open to a page dated September 1910. The handwriting was elegant and feminine, and the visible text read, "He struck me again today when I burned the dinner. I cannot continue like this much longer." The second image showed a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The envelope on top was addressed to Miss Catherine Whitmore at the Hudson Valley Psychiatric Institute. The return address showed it had been sent from Boston, but there was no sender name. The third image showed a single piece of paper with handwriting on it. Margaret enlarged the image as much as she could. The text read, "I was 5 years old when Mother died. I was 12 when Catherine was taken away. I was 22 when Father finally died. I am 96 now, and I have carried this burden my entire life. I saw everything. I said nothing. May God forgive us for our silence." There it was. The answer. Ruth had written that note, probably in the months before her death, finally acknowledging what she had witnessed and what she had failed to do. She had been too young and too frightened to speak out when it mattered, and she had spent her entire life living with that guilt. The diary had been Eleanor's, documenting the abuse she endured. The letters had been sent to Catherine in the asylum, probably by Ruth, maintaining contact when everyone else had abandoned her sister. Ruth had kept all of it, these pieces of evidence, for decades, and when she died, she had made sure they would be sold, scattered to strangers, perhaps hoping that someone would find them and finally tell the story that her family had worked so hard to hide. Margaret knew what she had to do. She contacted Patricia and offered to purchase any remaining Whitmore family items that hadn't been sold. Patricia checked her records and found that the diary and the letters had been purchased by different people at the estate sale, but she had their contact information from the credit card receipts. With their permission, she could put Margaret in touch with them. Within a week, Margaret had made arrangements to buy both the diary and the letters. The buyers, who had purchased them as curiosities without really examining them, were happy to resell them for a modest profit. When the items arrived, Margaret and Dr. Chen spent an entire day examining them. Eleanor's diary covered the years 1908 through 1911, ending just weeks before her death. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, suggesting she only wrote when she had privacy and safety to do so. The abuse documented in the diary was systematic and severe. Thomas controlled every aspect of Eleanor's life. He monitored her conversations, restricted her access to money, forbade her from leaving the house without permission, and he hit her regularly. Whenever she displeased him, which could be anything from overcooking dinner to speaking too loudly to smiling at someone he didn't approve of. The entries showed Eleanor's desperate attempts to protect her children from witnessing the violence, though she knew they heard everything. She wrote about Catherine becoming withdrawn and anxious, about William starting to mimic his father's angry outbursts, about little Ruth becoming so quiet that sometimes Eleanor worried she had stopped speaking altogether. She wrote about feeling trapped, about knowing she couldn't leave because she had no money and no skills that would allow her to support 3 children. She wrote about considering suicide, but rejecting it because she couldn't abandon her children to Thomas's sole care. The final entry, dated July 1911, just weeks before her death, was the most disturbing. She wrote that Thomas had threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave, and she believed him. The letters that Ruth had sent to Catherine at the asylum were heartbreaking. They showed a young woman trying to maintain a connection with her imprisoned sister, while also trying to survive in her father's house. Ruth wrote in careful, coded language, aware that asylum staff would read the letters before giving them to Catherine. She wrote about the weather, about books she was reading, about small details of daily life. But between the lines, the real message was clear. She believed Catherine. She remembered what had happened to their mother. She was counting the days until their father died and she would be free. She promised Catherine that someday they would be together again, that they would leave Boston and start new lives somewhere else. But that reunion had never happened. Catherine had been released from the asylum in 1919, when Ruth was only 17 and still living under her father's control. By the time Thomas died in 1921 and Ruth was legally free to leave, Catherine had already been living alone in Albany for 2 years, supporting herself as a seamstress. Ruth had written several letters to Catherine after their father's death, judging from dates and references in Catherine's responses, which were also among the saved letters, but Catherine's replies were distant and formal. She didn't want to revisit the past. She didn't want to talk about their mother or their father or what they had both endured. She had survived by sealing off those memories, and she couldn't bear to have them reopened, even by the sister who understood. De Sacte Saut. Chen pointed out something Margaret hadn't initially noticed. The letters showed that Ruth had tried multiple times to get Catherine to move back to Boston, to live with her, to help each other heal. But Catherine had refused every time. The trauma of what she had endured in the asylum, the years of being told she was crazy for speaking the truth, had damaged her too deeply. She couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even Ruth. So the 2 sisters had lived separate lives for the next 3 decades, connected only by occasional letters that became less frequent over time. When Catherine died in 1953, Ruth had been 49 years old, living alone in the house she had purchased with her inheritance from Thomas. She had never married, never had close friends that left any trace in the historical record, never built the new life she had promised Catherine they would have together. Margaret felt an overwhelming sadness for both sisters. Catherine had been punished for speaking the truth and had spent the rest of her life isolated and broken. Ruth had stayed silent out of fear and youth, and she had spent the rest of her life consumed by guilt. Neither of them had escaped their father's violence, even though he had been dead for decades. The trauma had followed them, shaped them, prevented them from ever finding peace or happiness. And their brother William had become the abuser, perpetuating the cycle for another generation. The damage Thomas Whitmore had inflicted on his family had echoed forward through time, destroying lives for decades after his death. Dr. Chen suggested they compile everything they had found into a comprehensive account. The photograph, the diary, the letters, the death certificates, the census records, the police reports, the newspaper articles, the asylum records, all of it together told a complete story of domestic violence in early 20th century America. It showed how abuse was hidden, how women were trapped, how those who spoke out were punished, how children were damaged, and how the effects rippled through generations. This wasn't just the Whitmore family's story anymore. It was a historical document that could help people understand how domestic violence functioned in an era when society refused to acknowledge it, and how many of those same dynamics still existed today. Margaret and Dr. Chen spent the next 3 months preparing their findings for publication. Dr. Chen wrote an academic article for a history journal, using the Whitmore case as an example of how domestic violence was systematically concealed in early 20th century American society. Margaret wrote a more accessible piece for a popular magazine, focusing on the human story of Eleanor and her children. Both articles included images of the photograph, particularly the telling mirror reflection that had started the entire investigation. The response was overwhelming. Historians contacted them wanting to study the materials. Journalists wrote follow-up pieces. Domestic violence organizations used the story in their educational programs, showing how abuse had been hidden and normalized throughout history. The photograph itself became something of a symbol. It demonstrated how carefully abusers and their families worked to present a facade of normalcy to the outside world, and how even in that carefully controlled image, the truth could slip through. The mirror reflection that showed Eleanor's fear and her bruise had accidentally preserved evidence that the family had tried to conceal. It was a reminder that abuse leaves traces, even when victims and perpetrators work hard to hide it, and that sometimes those traces survive long enough for someone to notice and care. Margaret donated all the materials to a special collection at Boston University, where they would be preserved and made available for researchers. Eleanor's diary, Ruth's letters to Catherine, the photograph, and all the supporting documents were catalogued and digitized. Students and scholars could now access them, could study them, could learn from them. The donation was made in Eleanor's name, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Eleanor Whitmore and all women who suffered in silence." The university held a small ceremony when the collection was formally opened. Margaret attended, along with Dr. Chen and several representatives from the domestic violence organizations that had benefited from Ruth's estate. During the ceremony, someone asked Margaret how she felt about having spent so much time investigating a family's painful secrets. She thought carefully before answering. She said that at first, she had been driven by curiosity and by a desire to understand what the photograph was showing. But as she learned more about Eleanor and her children, it had become personal. These weren't just historical figures anymore. They were real people who had suffered real trauma and whose suffering had been ignored and forgotten. By uncovering their story, by making sure it was documented and remembered, she felt like she was giving them something that had been denied to them in life. Acknowledgement, validation, justice, however late it came. The impact of the Whitmore case extended beyond academic circles. Several women contacted Margaret after reading her magazine article, sharing their own family stories of hidden abuse. They told her about grandmothers who had died under suspicious circumstances, about great-aunts who had been institutionalized for being difficult, about family photographs that showed bruises and fear if you looked closely enough. These women had grown up with vague family stories, with hints and whispers about things that weren't discussed, and the Whitmore case helped them understand what had really happened in their families. It gave them permission to acknowledge the truth and to stop protecting the reputations of abusers who had been dead for decades. Margaret kept the original photograph in her shop, framed and displayed where customers could see it. She created a small placard explaining what the image showed and what she had discovered about the family. People would stop and stare at it for long minutes, studying the mirror reflection, thinking about what it meant. Some visitors shared their own experiences with domestic violence, seeing in Eleanor's face something they recognized from their own lives or the lives of people they knew. The photograph became a conversation starter, a teaching tool, a memorial. Years later, Margaret would still think about the Whitmore family. She would wonder what Eleanor might have accomplished if she had been free from violence, what Catherine might have become if she hadn't been institutionalized, what Ruth might have experienced if she hadn't spent her life crushed by guilt and fear. She would think about William too, about how being raised in a violent home had turned him into his father, and about how his children had probably carried their own trauma forward. The cascade of damage from one man's violence, spreading across generations, seemed almost incomprehensible in its scope. But she also thought about the ways the story had created positive change. The academic articles had influenced how historians studied domestic violence in the early 20th century. The materials in the university collection were being used to train social workers and counselors. The publicity had led to increased donations to the organizations that Ruth had named in her will, and countless individuals had been moved to examine their own family histories more honestly, to stop concealing abuse that had happened decades ago, and to break cycles of violence in their own lives. Eleanor Whitmore had died in 1911, probably murdered by her husband, definitely failed by everyone who could have helped her. But in 2025, more than a century later, her story was finally being told. Her suffering was finally being acknowledged, and that acknowledgement was helping other women, other families, other survivors. It wasn't the justice Eleanor deserved. Nothing could undo what had been done to her. But it was something. It was a way of saying that her life mattered, that her pain mattered, that she would not be forgotten. The photograph that should have stayed hidden in the attic had instead become a testament to one woman's suffering and to the importance of seeing, speaking, and remembering the truth, no matter how long it takes. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.